So I want to welcome everyone to our session, Reframing Community Exposures to Better Capture Aviation-Related Health Effects. And in a moment, I'm going to invite my co-chair, Debbie Wagner, to do our session introduction.
Our session is the health panel, and the title of our session is Reframing Community Exposures to Better Capture Aviation-Related Health Effects. This session will present important community and research perspectives that provide evidence for reframing approaches to measuring and modeling the impact of noise and air pollution. And our first speaker for this session is Dr. Iona Chang, and she is also will be presenting virtually. She is a professor at UCSF in the Department of Epidemiology and Biostatistics. She is the head of the Cancer Epidemiology Division. Dr. Chang is a cancer epidemiologist and principal investigator of multiple NIH-funded projects aimed at examining molecular, lifestyle, environmental, and neighborhood factors in relation to cancer risk. She has an extensive research program investigating racial and ethnic differences in cancer risk. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Chang.
Thank you, Debbie, for that nice introduction. I hope everybody can hear me in the audience, and I apologize that I cannot be there in person today. So I will start us off for our session. So I would like to thank the organizers for inviting me today to speak to you about our work investigating the associations of airport-related ultrafine particles with cancer in the multi-ethnic cohort study. So for an overview of my talk today, first, I'm going to start with a brief introduction about the multi-ethnic cohort study, and then share with you our findings where we've looked at the relationship between exposure to airport-related ultrafine particles and cancer, and then just end with some comments on future directions. So first, to set the stage about the multi-ethnic cohort. So this cohort study was established in 1993. It is still actively being followed. And it was designed purposely back in the 1990s to really ask the question to understand what may be the contribution of various lifestyle factors, and particularly diet and nutrition, as well as genetic susceptibility in the relationship to the causation of cancer. And in this past about 10 years or so, given various advances in technology with geospatial research, we really extended our investigations to look at environmental stressors, which I'll speak about today. So it is a population-based study that includes over 215,000 men and women who are residents of Los Angeles County and Hawaii. And we specifically were interested in 5 main racial ethnic groups. So this includes African American, Japanese Americans, Latino, Native Hawaiian, and white participants. And at their time of enrollment, from 1993 to 1996, they were 45 to 75 years of age. So our work in the multi-ethnic cohort really focuses on trying to understand what could be some of the underlying factors that contribute to the differences in cancer burden across race ethnicity. So here, this just illustrates some of the incidence of common cancers within the MEC among males and females. And the patterns we see here within the multi-ethnic cohort does mirror what we see nationally. So just for example, among males, you can see prostate cancer outlined in blue, a much higher incidence of prostate cancer experienced by African American men in comparison to Japanese American, Native Hawaiian, Latinos, and whites. From colorectal cancer in orange, there's a much higher burden among African American and Japanese American males in comparison to other groups. And for lung cancer, African American and Native Hawaiian males have a much higher incidence of lung cancer within the MEC. Among females, we see that Native Hawaiian women experience a much higher incidence rate of breast cancer in comparison to the other racial ethnic groups, as seen in the magenta color. For colorectal cancer, a much higher incidence among African American females. And then for lung cancer, both Native Hawaiian and African American females have a higher burden of lung cancer incidence. And so we really try to understand, what may be some of the factors that can be driving these racial ethnic disparities in the burden of cancer that can be targeted for prevention and intervention work. So one really unique aspect of the multi-ethnic cohort was the fact that we have prospectively collected residential addresses over time. And so with these residential addresses and various geospatial resources has really expanded our work in terms of looking at environmental factors. And so these are actually address records for MEC participants over time, starting from the enrollment in 1993 to 2021. So these are address records. And here we have represented probably about over 200,000 address records for these about 110,000 LA participants. You can see that the African-American participants, they're colored in yellow. And we recruited these participants by targeting a census tract, which had a high proportion of African-American participants. And they are concentrated more in the East and Central LA. For the Latino participants, they were recruited based on surname list and DMV records, and you can see that they are widely residing across all of LA County. And then for Japanese Americans, similar, they were recruited based on surname list and DMV records. And for the white participants, they weren't specifically recruited out of our LA County areas, but there were individuals who self-identified as white. So you really can see here the rich address records we have for these participants over time among the surviving members. And this really has been a valuable resource for our geospatial work. So we have done various studies looking at air pollution and health in the MEC, largely focusing on cancer sites. As you can see here, some of the studies that we've conducted, but we've also leveraged the cohort to look at other health conditions that we know are or have considered to be involved in air pollution-related health effects, including COPD and arthritis. And today I'm going to specifically be focusing on our studies of airport-related ultrafine particles in relationship to brain and lung cancer. So first, to set the stage for those who may not be familiar in regards to our work in brain cancer and what are our current statistics and what do we know. So for brain cancer, it is a more rare type of cancer. It was estimated in 2023, there were over 24,000 new cases in the US. That represents about 1% of all new cancer case diagnosis. In 2023, there are estimated almost 19,000 estimated deaths, representing about 3% of all cancer deaths. So what do we know in terms of risk factors? There are established risk factors for brain cancer, including radiation, family history of brain cancer, some inherited genetic syndromes and weakened immune system, and putative risk factors. These include, ongoing work trying to understand environmental exposures and allergies. And there still remains much to be understood about what may be some of the risk factors driving the development of brain cancer. So for lung cancer is a much more common cancer. In 2023, there are over 230,000 new cases of lung cancer occurring in the US, estimated, representing about 12% of all new cancer cases. Lung cancer is a leading cause of cancer death in the US. There were over 127,000 estimated deaths attributed to lung cancer, representing about 21% of all cancer deaths. I think many of us are well familiar that smoking is a major risk factor for lung cancer, both active smoking and secondhand smoke. Air pollution, particularly particulate matter, has been identified as a risk factor, along with family history of lung cancer, radon asbestos exposure, radiation therapy, some previous lung diseases, and then ongoing work to try to understand some additional putative risk factors, including obesity and diet. So while air pollution is known to be a risk factor for lung cancer, I think we all recognize that air pollution is a mixture of many pollutants, and there's still work to be done to really understand some of the components of particulate matter and understanding their role in lung cancer development. So our focus today will be talking about our work in terms of ultrafine particles. So these are defined as a subset of particulate matter smaller than 100 nanometers in diameter. And so this figure illustrates for you, you can see in this red box here, ultrafine particles in relationship to other PM of larger diameters of 2.5, PM10 in comparison, illustrating a diagram here of a fine grain of sand, as well as human hair, just to put in perspective how small these particles are. These ultrafine particles can be deposited throughout the airways and penetrate the bloodstream and circulation. And there has been work to show that these ultrafine particles can cross the blood-brain barrier, which is a highly regulated barrier within the human physiological system. And some of the potential biological pathways that have been implicated in regards to ultrafine particle toxicity include inflammation and oxidative stress. So we were really interested in trying to understand particularly the relationship between airport-related ultrafine particles. So there is not routine monitoring of ultrafine particles in the US and in most other countries. And so we partnered with Scott Fruin at USC and Timothy Larson at the University of Washington, because they had done some work in terms of where they had estimated ultrafine particle concentrations based on LAX flight activities using an American Meteorological Society and EPA regulatory dispersion model based on this 53 by 43 kilometer grid, which they were able to estimate concentrations around this grid area for our period of our study from 1993 to 2013. And this model accounted for meteorological, atmospheric stability, mixing height, and hourly changes in flight activity. And they did some validation work using mobile measurements and found good agreement. And it was notable that their work had identified that LAX-related ultrafine particles were 4 to 5 times greater than background levels in downwind communities for extended distances, likely due to descending jets. And so with these ultrafine particle exposures, we were able to link these to the residential histories of the MEC participants to look at the relationships with various cancer outcomes. So, but first, what is the field found in regards to ultrafine particles in cancer? And the work that has been done to date has largely all focused on ambient ultrafine particle exposure. There hasn't been studies that specifically focused only on airport-related ultrafine particles. So there was one prior study conducted in Canada, and they had found an 11% increased risk of brain cancer associated with ambient ultrafine particles per 10,000 particles per centimeter cubed. There was a few more studies conducted for lung cancer, a study in LA, which found a modest association with historical ambient ultrafine particles and lung cancer mortality, not incidence, which is the focus of our study. A Dutch study that did find a 4% increased risk associated with ambient ultrafine particles, and a Canadian study that did not find an association. So there really hasn't been that much work looking at ultrafine particles in relationship to cancer, but I think some suggestive evidence to warrant the study of the role of ultrafine particles. So our research question was to look at what could be the associations between airport-related ultrafine particles with brain and lung cancer risk within the multi-ethnic cohort study. So first here, I'm going to share with you our findings looking at brain cancer in relationship to airport-related ultrafine particles within our California MEC. And this was work that was conducted and led by Dr. Anna Wu at USC. So here, I know there's a lot of data to look at here, but for those who may not be familiar, here we're looking at hazard ratio estimates. So this is a risk estimate, and we can think of when a hazard ratio is above 1, that is demonstrating a positive association. And we can think about this as the increased risk associated with ultrafine particles per an interquartile range, which is about 6,000 particles in overall that we're looking here. And we looked at this ultrafine particle exposure based on various kind of combinations. So as you can see here on to the right, this figure of the ultrafine exposure grid, we looked at combinations of whether or not a participant had any address, so they ever lived within the grid, or if all of their addresses were in the grid, so that means their entire residential history, they lived within the ultrafine particle grid exposure area. And then also Dr. Fruin and Dr. Larson help identify what's referred to as impact zone. So that's that blue oval where there's higher levels of ultrafine particle exposure. And so we asked the same question, what about participants who just had one address or lived at one point within this impact zone, and also all of their address across their entire residential history from 1993 to 2013. And so in the overall column, you can see the hazard ratios are above 1. They are suggestive of a positive association, meaning that increased risk of brain cancer associated with an increasing exposure to airport-related ultrafine particles. Among African-American participants in particular, here you can see bolded, and we have this 95 confidence interval, not including null, so this indicates that it's statistically significant. We can see this consistent pattern where we identify an increased risk of brain cancer among these African-American participants with ultrafine particle exposures. And when we look across the other racial ethnic groups, we don't see as much of a clear signal and no association with Japanese Americans. So I think specifically here, if you remember that map I showed you earlier in terms of the location that African American participants in the MEC, you can see they are highly concentrated very close to the LAX airport. They do have higher ultrafine particle exposure, and we are picking up a signal here for an association with brain cancer risk. I think also to remember that I mentioned that brain cancer is a rare cancer, so there are smaller number of cases here. So you can see down below, we have roughly, 36 brain cancer cases across these various groupings that we've looked by address records. But I think this really provides evidence that we do need to extend this work and really try to see in other studies if we see similar findings, in particular among those who may be living very close to the LAX airport. We also recently looked at this in relationship to lung cancer, just following our similar approach for brain cancer. In this table, I'm showing you the risk estimates per ultrafine particle exposure, and now I'm just showing you one estimate, any address in the grid, because we saw various similar associations across those various levels that we looked at. And I'm showing for overall lung cancer, as well as lung cancer has several different types of cell types, where we have actually good numbers to actually look at differences across cell types, as illustrated here in this table. And you can see among all participants, we actually really aren't picking up association with ultrafine particles and lung cancer risk. We do see when we look at it by males and females, there is potentially a signal for squamous cell carcinoma to be associated with ultrafine particle exposures among males. For females, you can also see a hazard ratio of 1.05. It actually was borderline statistically significant. So if this is, giving us some indication that there could be potentially some type of cell type specific effects. The other study in LA, they also similarly found these modest association and actually also did see potentially there could be some histological cell type effects. And just to also share, within the multi-ethnic cohort, as we followed these individuals over time, we've really collected a lot of extensive questionnaire information. So both of our studies were able to account for various demographic, smoking, various lifestyle factors that we also know to be at play influencing the risk of lung cancer. So just to walk through what are some of the strengths and limitation of this work. So the extensive residential history information that we have for these MEC participants really gives us an opportunity to look at long-term exposure. And we have this extended follow-up in terms of, we know, cancer is a disease that develops, later in life. So we actually, over time, actually have a quite a bit robust number in terms of number of incident cancers occurring within the mouth. As I mentioned, we have a lot of extensive information on various health behaviors, lifestyle factors that we can account for in our statistical analysis, and that we have the inclusion of good numbers of underrepresented populations, and particularly the African-American and Latino participants in LA. Some of our limitations is that our work is focused on looking at residential addresses, and we don't have information on work locations. So we all recognize, in addition to where we live, where we work, where we play, also could contribute to various environmental exposures. And within our California component of the MEC, we were limited on the number of Japanese American white participants. So those participants come largely from our Hawaii study. And unfortunately, what's still to be done is when we're able to look at a similar study among our Hawaii side of the cohort. So what are our future directions? So we really would love to be able to extend this work, looking at ultrafine particle exposures to other airports beyond LAX. And clearly there needs to be replication. I think for epidemiological studies, that is really the key to, confirm findings across other study populations. And then also extend this to other health outcomes that we know air pollution to be involved, not only cancer. I think there are many other sites that this could be highly relevant to examine. We also, like to be able to try to really focus on what might be the most vulnerable subpopulations. This could be by age, this could be by those who have chronic conditions, those could be by socioeconomic status or various social, environmental, and built environment effects. So we really can understand differences across groups. We do also recognize that, there are multiple pollutants at play. So there are models that we can extend to look at multiple pollutants. We have done work looking at co-pollutant models and found very similar associations. Noise is definitely something that we'd like to incorporate. I think one of our challenges is that we, because of the cohort started in 1993, having historical noise information is one thing that, we would really like to be able to have, because then we can use our full cohort. And then really, the motivation of our work is in terms of us identifying these associations, helping to generate the evidence that could be most informative to develop partnership with community policy stakeholders to understand what would be most informative for them to advocate for maintaining air quality standards to define clean air. So with that, I would like to acknowledge this a really great team of colleagues and investigators across multiple institutions contributing this work. In particular, I'd like to recognize Anna Wu, who leads these studies with me within the MEC, and then Timothy Larson and Scott Fruin, who really lead our ultrafine particle exposure assessment, and then our funders from the NIH and also the Brain and Lung Tumor Air Pollution Foundation.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
So I'll ask the audience to share any questions in the Slido deck, and we'll be covering those at the end of the session today. And now I'll call up Brian Johnson. Brian Johnson has worked for 38 years as a reliability engineer at the Palo Verde Generating Station. He holds 2 master's degrees in mechanical engineering from Rensselaer Polytechnic Institute and a master's from Harvard University in sustainability. He's going to be presenting today on aircraft sound.
Okay, so I'd like to share some findings that I had when I did my master's thesis at Harvard. And it concerns aircraft noise, something I did not care about. I learned to care about it, so I guess we'll go forward. Okay, I'd like to start out with the premise of this whole sound thing, and everybody's familiar with this, and I'm not going to spend much time with it. But the Schultz curve is the target. And I guess a recent survey the FAA did to see if the numbers were any different than they've been the last 40 years was that it doesn't work. So the annoyance thing, the Schultz curve, does not work. That's what we have. That's our premise. So some common sense questions. If it doesn't work, why hasn't it been changed to something else? What the heck are we doing keeping a criteria in place for 50 years that hasn't worked for 50 years? And why do we keep on using it? Okay, so I'm going to focus on this point. The first question would be, what kind of noise does an airplane make? So a little story about my wife, and she's in the back of the room. We live 17 miles from the Phoenix Sky Harbor Airport, and NextGen caused an impact to us. It moved the airplanes 2.5 miles, and they began to fly over our house sometime. We're not a heavy, Sky Harbor is a busy airport. We were not one of the busy corridors, but they were there. And so she asked me, said, well, why are we hearing this noise? What's going on? So being an engineer, I had to answer that question. It was a curiosity. And I did my internet search, and I could not find a single graph anywhere on the internet back when I looked that showed the sound that an airplane makes. So why in the world, if we're worried about aircraft noise, can't we see a full sound spectrum from 20 to 20,000 hertz and see what it looks like? I couldn't find it. So that raised an alarm. What in the heck does this mean? So what I did as part of my thesis, I'm an engineer, I'm a reliability engineer, I'm a vibration expert, among other things. I got a multi-channel analyzer, I got calibrated vibration probes, calibrated microphones. I set up an experiment to measure what an aircraft does and what noise it makes. Okay, so the rest of this is going to be based upon experimental data, and my thesis is laid out in a way that anybody could repeat it. I had over 100 experiments and I got the same answer every time. You know, I know what noise an airplane makes. Then the last point is the criteria is a silly Schultz curve annoyance, when the real criteria with recent publications by the FAA is that it really ought to be based upon health. And that health is high blood pressure, stroke, and heart attack. There is a preponderance of evidence out there saying that the closer people live to an airport, the more likely they are to die from a cardiovascular risk. So why the heck aren't we talking about how we can incorporate that into our criteria? And why are we holding on to a 50-year-old dead criteria? Okay, so my experiment. This is a box that I built, my wife and I built to simulate a house. A standard construction material, 2x4, insulation in the walls, a dual pane window. It is built like that. So to this box, on the outside, we put a microphone. What kind of sound do we hear in the air? We put a vibration probe right on the top of the box. If you get vibrations through the air, the question is do they vibrate hard, substantial physical things? Yes is the answer to that. On the inside of the box, also a microphone. You can see it kind of propped in the middle, so it's only going to measure what makes it through the box, what makes it through the insulation that we're putting into houses to mitigate sound, okay? That was meant to simulate that. That thing in the middle is ballistic gel, FBI ballistic gel that they've designed to shoot bullets into because they think it's a good simulation for human flesh. So to that, I suspended it on bungee cords on a Frisbee of all things. You know, scientific research can include a Frisbee. And I put a low frequency vibration probe on it, calibrated to 5 hertz. So this is below the 20 hertz. You know, what's the chance that noise, if it's showing up at 20 hertz, could be showing up below that in the infrasound region? Okay, so that got it going. So what does it look like? So this is a typical sound measurement of what an airplane does when it flies over your head. Okay, do you see where the noise is? Now, the noise is down on the low frequency spot. In fact, that 5 to 20 hertz is where almost the strongest noise is, and that's infrasound. Okay, so that is sound that's traveling through the air that is coming in contact with people or things or anything else from an airplane. Do you see that circled region off to the right-hand side? I circled the region that is included in the FAA criteria that says this is the sound measurement that we use to calculate a DNL. Does anybody see an obvious problem with that? You know, it's absolutely ridiculous because that straight line, you can magnify it 10,000 times and see some energy, but that straight line area is the sound that the criteria says this is what we hear. And they have a sound measurement that is able to focus on that called dBA. So anything outside of that dBA region is subtracted out. So does anybody think there's a problem with subtracting out everything to the left-hand side? The noise that an airplane really makes? Well, let's go a little deeper. Okay, so sound comparisons, and I'm just going to focus on 70 dB, which is what you'd hear if you stand by the side of a busy freeway. Everybody knows what that sounds like. One of the quietest environments that we have on Earth is the sound studio. Okay, 20 dB. That's a 50 dB difference. Okay, does everybody have kind of the feel for what that difference is? Okay, so this is the dBA weighted sound, what it does to the sound measurement. If you look at 20 hertz, it subtracts out 50 decibels. What does that mean? If there's 100,000 energy units that represent the sound, only one of the 100,000 is kept for the DNL criteria. So this dBA is subtracting 999,999 out. It's not included. Okay, it's a big problem with that. I've included the dBc, which is a very common sound measurement to show the comparison. And I would suggest, I'd make a call right now that we discontinue dBA and go to dBc, because DBC is going to capture a good share of the sound that an airplane makes, plus it does take a little bit out for that premise that we shouldn't focus so much on the sounds that we don't hear as readily, which is what the basis of using the DBA was. So you look at the bottom, that small graph on the bottom, you see that big X? The actuality is that when you apply DBA to the airplane sound, all of that is gone. It's not in the criteria. It's not part of the DNL calculation. Any big surprise why the Schultz curve doesn't work? No, to me, by inspection, I'd say we're probably subtracting out 99% plus of the sound that the airplane makes. And if we're taking that out, no big surprise that people, when they hear this airplane noise, that actually consists almost exclusively of noise that's no longer part of the DNL criteria, that it doesn't match up. Big problem. Okay, so I'm going to zoom in on that little area. I don't know, is this a laser pointer? I guess that can't help. There are three things going here. The one chart up in the upper left-hand corner that I showed earlier, this is the aircraft noise. Directly to the side of that, the one thing I found about aircraft noise in all of my search back when I wrote the thesis was that chart. And that chart is what the noise energy looks like when all of the DBA calculation has been made. Now, if you look at the units of that, that had to be zoomed in 10,000 times to see the data. Okay, so over what the maximum data was. 10,000 times. It took 10,000 times zoom to take that straight line to what you can see, but you can clearly see that all of that energy that the airplane really does put out, the sounds it really do make, is gone. On the bottom, it's kind of interesting. Because I had inside and outside of a box, I was able to determine how much of the energy was lost just simply because the airplane was high in the air. So these higher frequency things, as the sound travels through air, air has mass. And that mass attenuates or takes away some of the energy. And you can see on that blue arrow pointing down, that at about 1500 hertz, the energy through the air is gone. It's the same thing as inside the house, inside the box. So that 1,000 to 4,000 criteria we have within the assumption of what airplane noises make, when the airplane begins to go higher, it goes away because the air takes it away. Okay, so my opinion is that it would be much easier to defend an argument that aircraft sound measurements processed with a DBA manipulation is completely unrelated to aircraft sound rather than it's related. If we're keeping 1% or less of the noise, how can you say that's aircraft noise? Now, the second thing is once we attract it all out or subtract it all out, when that airplane flies around and you hear that booming sound, and everyone's heard that booming sound, sometimes you can barely see the airplane. So all of the sound that would be measured or captured within the criteria is gone. Only thing is left is sound that by the criteria we're not supposed to be able to hear. So if we can't hear it, but we really do hear it, that's why the correlation is so poor on that Schultz curve. The other part about this is I measured the vibration, and clearly if you look from the left to the right, the microphone is to the left, the accelerometer is to the right, and this is on the outside of the box. And you can see that the energy that hits the box causes the box to vibrate. Okay? Now it does the same thing to the ballistic gel on the inside of the box. So the reality is this stuff travels right through the box. These sound waves less than 40 hertz go right through. They're not stopped at all by the insulation. They're not stopped by almost anything. They go right through and they make contact with whatever's inside and they cause it to vibrate, cause it to shake. So that insulation we're putting into attics does a very good job of taking out that 1%. It is doing practically nothing to take out the other 99%. And the correlation, when we drive down the road, we see these massive sound walls, freeway sound walls. And these things are concrete and they're 20 feet high. Now, why do you suppose we need 20-foot concrete sound walls? Well, because a lot of that is low frequency sound. And that low frequency, they're very long, big waves. They've got to interact with something very dense to take the sound out. So the reality of it is the mitigation really, to really take care of this problem would be to put concrete on everyone's roof that's impacted of several inches. That would take care of the sound problem that people are experiencing. The actual noise the airplane is making, it would require thick concrete roofs. Very different solution than our colleagues from Sea-Tac were talking about this morning. And I appreciate all they're doing to help people with what they have, I really do. Okay, so we're going to transition into something else, and that would be where I think the criteria should go. So this was taken from an FAA website talking about hypertension, talking about blood pressure. Okay, if you look at this, it's pretty alarming. So we're looking at adults that live in the proximity of an airport, and they've determined that a small dB increase leads to an increase in blood pressure. An increase in blood pressure leads to an increase in the occurrence of stroke or cardiovascular issues. The one on the bottom, I think, is the one that really kind of caught my attention. But they looked at prescription data of almost 1 million people near a German airport, one of these big meta studies. And they found at 40 dBA, 40 to 45 dBA, that for women there was a 27% increase in blood pressure issues. Now think about that, and 40 dBA is a library. Now, do you think you should get blood pressure issues if you're in a library? No, I think you probably wouldn't think you should get blood pressure issues in a library. But if that sound, that infrasound, that low frequency stuff is going right through the walls and interacting with your body, then that would be an explanation for why you are getting it. Okay, and then the other thing it says is the risk of developing high blood pressure goes up as the dBA number goes up. And the dBA is silly. Really, it's a silly thing, but it still goes up. All right, so a little bit more about low frequency aircraft noise. Okay, so most of the noise that an airplane makes is below 20 hertz. And my study included an accelerometer calibrated at 5 hertz. So you go to the internet and you ask the internet to tell you what is a typical resonance frequency of a human body. Now, what does that mean? That sounds like a pretty fancy term, right? So as we breathe, as our heart pumps, as our blood flows, it causes natural vibrations in our body. Okay, that just happens. So a resonance would be when you take a natural frequency of a body, which is defined by its mass and its weight, and those are the two factors that go into the natural frequency. If you add those two things together, and you excite that natural frequency with an external source, you can amplify it. So examples of that, anyone that's done the bathtub experience, you're giving a grandchild or a child a bath, you put your hand in the water and you start doing this. Doesn't take very many of these and you can empty the entire tub. This is a natural frequency. You push a child or a partner on the swing, and when you push them, it takes very little additional effort to make them go really high. If you're a little bit off and you get out of sequence, you stop them almost cold. So the natural frequency in the body, we have aircraft vibration that are at that frequency and are causing that to excite. So this gentleman in Portugal, and this is what I found 5 years ago. I don't know if there's more current information, but he worked at a military base as a doctor and noticed a high increase in cardiovascular issues, did autopsies on people that had that. What he found was that there were tears in the cardiovascular system. So just like the bodybuilders that pump the weights, they tear their muscles, the muscles repair, they get bigger, thicker, stronger. The cardiovascular system, by his opinion, did the same thing, causing little tiny tears in the blood vessels and cells. And when they repaired, they got harder. And if you stiffen up the cardiovascular system, you increase the risk of a cardiovascular event. His opinion on that. It seems reasonable. Seems very reasonable to me. Okay, so I made a call to stop using dBA for aircraft noise, use the DBC. I think the DNL probably works fine, and probably everything will begin to line up if we actually include aircraft-generated noise within the equation, which we are not doing right now. So the problem with that is as soon as we do that, those boundaries around airports, which nobody likes because they're fairly big right now, will expand significantly. Once we actually include aircraft noise, they'll get really big. When they get really big, they're going to begin to correlate. That 20 hertz area, the bottom of the range, was within that region where it was going up. I believe if we carry that through, that information will represent the plane and it will begin to show us good things. So I would suggest that we heard from the Sea-Tac people 5 out of 7. We need to put something in there that says that all future aircraft studies will include DBC in addition to DBA. And the reason for that is that we'll begin to finally include real aircraft noise in the criteria we use to protect communities. So no big surprise that communities are not very happy because they have continual noise issues. And that is because they're complaining about sound that isn't even included in the criteria. And they don't know any different. It's so complicated, they don't know any different. Okay, so now as far as the data, the other thing it showed me is that full energy, and I'm going to say every time the plane flies over, it's an exposure because there's a potential cumulative health risk, but up to about a mile high, the energy was the same, up to down. And about 1.5 miles wide at the airport, the energy was the same. 5 miles out, the energy was the same, but the sides were converging. It doesn't mean there weren't reduced exposures. So there is an envelope, at least in the Phoenix market, 5 miles from the airport, where the exposure is the same. No, not this little tiny thing we have with the DNL. A great big thing. This needs to be part of our discussion. The communities need to really begin to understand this, and they need to demand that we get answers, that demand that the sound that we are using in aircraft studies represents the sound that an airplane makes, not the sounds that people generally hear. Because those sounds aren't being made by airplanes. Yeah, there's a tiny bit, that 1% or whatever the percentage is there, but it's not doing much compared to the mass that we're getting rid of. Okay, so recommendations, DBA and DBC is all we should do in the future. And I think when we take the DBC and begin to drop it into the DNL calculation and begin to see its impact and see that it actually does represent the sound that we see better, then we'll have the data we can use to drive the change. I don't know if the way things move that we could do that just by saying one presentation this guy thinks, although I would suggest that anybody could repeat these measurements. It's all laid out. And I think that hypertension should be the criteria, not annoyance. The European data clearly shows that the closer you live to an airport, the more likely you are to generate high blood pressure. It causes it. And if we have an increase in high blood pressure, we have an issue where we have more strokes and heart attacks. So this is a health issue. It's been established, it's been defined. The FAA included it in their website, included its report. So this is not information that I found in some obscure place. I found it within the FAA. We should act on it. Okay, so I think the last point I had is that I believe if we include the DBC, that all of a sudden the Schultz curve will probably line up because we'll actually be including the noise that people are hearing, not the tiny subportion of it that we believe they're most sensitive to hearing. When you have a 10,000 time difference in the amount of sound energy at 20 hertz than you have at the data you're recording, and you're not considering it, I think we're a little off if we think that 10,000 doesn't matter, and that people aren't hearing it because they are. Okay, so that's what I have. Thank you very much. I'm out of time. Take care.
Thank you, Brian. And I would like to introduce our last speaker. He is Daniel Fink, MD, who is a board-certified internist with an MBA from Wharton. He serves as an expert consultant to the World Health Organization on its Make Listening Safe program, and as a subject matter expert on noise and the public for the National Center for Environmental Health, at CDC. He will speak today about the fact that the FAA allows Americans to be exposed to unsafe levels of aviation noise. And I just want to remind the audience, please send your questions in on Slido for any speaker at any time. Thank you. Join me in welcoming Dr. Fink.
Thank you, Debbie. I'm sorry you're not here so I could meet you in person. I've never met Debbie. I've never met the first speaker. I just met Elena, and I have not communicated nor met with Brian other than one or two emails. We certainly didn't collaborate or collude, if you will, on our presentations, but his and mine dovetail very nicely. One of my mentors said, you always start with an anecdote or a joke. So today is election day, right? Everyone knows that. I forgot to put on my sticker. I voted by mail, the safest, most reliable form of voting. And today I want to remember Al Smith, Governor Smith. Some of you may know that he was the first Catholic to run for national office in 1928. He lost because he was a Catholic when he ran for president. Kennedy was the first Catholic elected president. Governor Smith, most of you probably don't know, being even younger than I am, Governor Smith was a noted extemporaneous speaker, and when he would speak to a Democratic function, he would say, fellow Democrats. And when he would speak to a general audience, he would say, fellow Americans. I think Lyndon Johnson stole that. Well, one day he was speaking about self-improvement at the Men's Correctional Institute at Ossining, New York, colloquially known as Sing Sing. Well, he couldn't say fellow Democrats or Republicans who were in prison too. He couldn't say fellow Americans or fellow citizens because they had lost the right to vote, the basic right of being a citizen. So he looks around and says, well, I'm so glad you all could be here today, as am I. I have a confession to make. Aviation noise is not my noise interest. My noise interest is restaurant noise. I want to find a quiet restaurant where I can enjoy the meal and the conversation with my wife. But as a doctor, as a former commissioned officer in the Public Health Service, as an expert consultant to World Health and a subject matter expert to CDC on noise in the public, when one of my noise colleagues who is interested in aviation noise did point out DNL 65 dBA compatible with residential land use, and from my research, library research, nothing like the first two speakers, that's all I do is library research, I knew what the safe noise levels were as calculated by the EPA, as mandated by Congress in the Noise Control Act of 1972. I felt that I had to speak out, so I presented this at the December 2022 meeting of the Acoustical Society of America. The manuscript is in press. I was assured on January 21 it would appear in 7 to 10 days. To my frustration, it hasn't, but it should be available soon. And I could just give this one slide and stop talking. The FAA states that DNL 65 dBA is compatible with residential land use that exceeds the calculated safe noise levels. I would point out that according to the principles of psychoacoustics, a 20 dB increase is perceived as 4 times louder, even in the A-weighted frequency range, and therefore the FAA is allowing Americans to be exposed to unsafe levels of aviation noise. I got a lot of slides. I'm only going to spend a second or two on most of them. Aviation noise is a problem in the air and on the ground. The FAA correctly states aircraft make noise. I would note that noise has auditory and non-auditory health effects. Most doctors, including my cardiologist brother until I pointed out to him, most doctors don't know that noise has non-auditory health effects. And except for certain military aircraft, aviation noise on the ground, unless you're working on the tarmac, does not cause hearing loss. So we're not going to talk about that further. One of the things I've been working on is redefining noise to include the harm that it makes. The standard definition, noise is unwanted sound, makes those of us complaining about any kind of noise, whether it be restaurant noise or aviation noise, makes us into neurotics, chronic complainers, people more interested in our own auditory comfort than in somebody flying somewhere or enjoying a harmless habit. And until the EPA in 1993 declared that environmental tobacco smoke, secondhand smoke, was a Class A carcinogen with no safe, no known lower level of exposure, all of a sudden, I was a health activist. I wasn't just a complainer about secondhand smoke. So the new definition of noise is unwanted and or harmful sound, and I wrote on the slide, often both unwanted and harmful, I might say almost always. Again, what most doctors don't know is that there are involuntary physiologic responses to noise, immediate increases in blood pressure and pulse, activation of the stress hormone axis and inflammatory response, hypertension, diabetes, obesity, as Brian mentioned, causing, again, as Brian mentioned, heart disease, stroke, increased mortality. What does the FAA officially say about the adverse health effects of noise? I could not find anything specific on the FAA website. If anyone has that, I apologize. Please send me the link. I did a Google search. I might have used the wrong search words. I only found one article that I'll mention later. The UK equivalent of the FAA does acknowledge adverse health effects. What did they say in 1985? They said, little valid scientific basis for claims of a health impact from aviation noise. That wasn't true, by the way, in 1985. The first session on noise as a health hazard, and there are 2 or 3 chapters in the published monograph by the American Speech and Hearing Association and the United States Public Health Service, 1968, and the monograph in 1969. The different statements of the FAA and the EPA, and one might question, does the FAA's mission to provide a safe airspace system extend to those on the ground under the flight paths? That's already been discussed earlier. The FAA considers aviation noise to be an annoyance. I tried to find, I think it's going to be the next slide, where that came from, why that decision was made. I couldn't, but it is. Now, annoyance seems trivial, but it's not. Each episode of aviation noise causes, it disrupts conversations, interrupts activities, disturbs sleep, decreases productivity at work, and the effects extend far beyond mere annoyance to stress, anger, frustration, and a sense of powerlessness. Noise is a hazard to the health of people everywhere. For reasons that, if we have time, we can discuss, aviation noise is more annoying than other forms of transportation noise. The Schultz curve has already been alluded to. This graph has been shown by Brian with the neighborhood environmental survey showing far more annoyance than Schultz had reported. This is a slide I was looking for. I couldn't figure out why they chose annoyance. My guess, having tried to do research myself, including some bench research and some survey research, is that you can assess annoyance merely by asking a question. You don't have to get doctor's records. You don't have to send health workers out to record blood pressures in a statistically valid randomized sample of people living a certain area from an airport or under flight path, et cetera, et cetera. So regardless, FAA chose annoyance just to make sure we're on the same page. I think we are. Our definitions of DNL, the metric issues have already been discussed. This is from my manuscript that's awaiting publication. A-weighting, and I interact much more with the NIOSH people than with the FAA people. A-weighting comes from occupational safety and health. The injury is the inability to hear speech. A-weighting adjusts unweighted sound measurements for the frequencies heard in human speech. Again, as Brian mentioned, we did not coordinate this. C-weighting is for machinery noise. And again, the DNL metric versus any other metrics that have been discussed. I would caution if FAA chooses a new metric, whatever that may be, and I'm not smart enough to figure that out, but it still needs to continue to calculate DNL using the 65 dBA metric so that we know is it safe or not, because otherwise the FAA might continue to insist that we still need to do more research. Again, this is a repeat of the second slide. This is from the EPA Table 1 in the EPA Noise Levels Monograph, which is celebrating its 50th year. Kudos to the EPA for getting it right 50 years ago when the technologies and the research was far less developed than it is now. What does the FAA think needs to be done? Well, I couldn't really find that out, but quoting from the summary of the Peters paper, where I think all the authors except one were either funded by DOT or FAA or employed by DOT or FAA, says more research. In the same year, 2018, that the Peters paper was republished, based on published research available to anyone with a device, a search engine, and an internet connection, World Health recommended 45 dB LDEN. LDEN includes an additional 5 decibel penalty for evening noise. I think it's 7 to 10 or 7 to 11. And for nighttime noise, we'll talk more about nighttime noise in a bit. Nighttime noise, 40 decibel sound level. What's the connection between annoyance and adverse health effects? Noise annoys people. Annoyance is stressful. Stress causes inflammation of the vascular lining. This effect has specifically been shown to be caused by transportation noise. The hormonal and cardiovascular changes cannot be habituated to. Even if we think we're used to them, we're physiologically not. Our bodies tell us that they're not, even if we were unaware. The mechanisms are now understood down to the cellular, molecular, even genetic levels. We don't need any more research. This schema was first developed by Wolfgang Babisch in Germany, 2014. It was refined by Thomas Munzel and his research team in Mainz, Germany. This is open access, so anyone can look at it. I can't read the things here, but it's down to the enzyme level. Most importantly, coming back to nighttime noise is particularly deleterious for the heart and has been linked in a study by Saucy, S-A-U-C-Y, in, I think, Zurich, directly to heart attacks. The plane flies over, Grandpa Joe, trying to sleep, has a heart attack. And this graph is from Munzel. Is there any doubt? Is this just a correlation or a statistical association? Well, Babisch, who was the world's expert on aviation noise till he retired, says the question is no longer whether noise causes cardiovascular disease, it's rather to what extent. And Matthias Bosner, who is professor of medicine and psychiatry at the University of Pennsylvania, is actually contracted with FAA to do research on aviation noise disrupting sleep, and I think he is the world's expert on noise disrupting sleep. I recommend his editorial last fall in the journal Sleep, all capitals S-L-E-E-P, again, open access. He says, no, it's accepted causality. How do we know it's causal? There's something called the Bradford-Hill criteria. So Austin Bradford Hill was the first physician in UK to make the connection between cigarette smoking and lung cancer. And people questioned, well, how do you know this? It could be radon in the air in the basement. It could be something else. It could be genetics, whatever. And Sir Austin Bradford Hill developed what are called the Bradford Hill criteria. These are listed here, and these are widely accepted as establishing causality for complex multi-factor epidemiology cause-effect studies. So this is my conclusion. The FAA is allowing Americans to be exposed to unsafe levels of aviation noise. I don't have a solution. I like to fly, but not I like to fly for pleasure. I fly to meetings. I'm a little concerned because the most time-efficient flight to Ottawa for my presentation at May's Acoustical Society of America meeting involves a 737 MAX 8. Friends and family have advised me to take 2 or 3 days to travel on other airplanes. It's like, no, I'm going to take the risk. And in conclusion, I have here, I'm program chair of the Quiet Coalition, which is a program of Quiet Communities Incorporated. I have some Quiet Communities merchandise here, concert merchandise. And if anyone can show me published evidence that 65 dBA is safe, you get a t-shirt, a coffee mug, and a magnetic sticker for your vehicle. Thank you very much. I'll stop there.
Thank you so much. We just have a few minutes left before lunch, and we've had a few questions submitted to the Slido. I'm going to start, and I'll invite both Brian and Daniel to join me. I think we'll start with a first question for Dr. Cheng, and hopefully you can unmute yourself. And it's a big picture question, which is, do you have a suggestion to fix some of the impacts that you're seeing related to UFPs in your cohort?
That is a big question. So I think for us as epidemiologists, we really want to try to partner with those who, stakeholders, community members, policy advocates, to understand what is the information they need to enact change. Right. And so for us to conduct that research, to provide that empirical evidence that's needed to help build that coalition to impact change, to regulating. I mean, there's no regulation for ultrafine particle emissions and levels. And so I think that's the first step, that we need to work towards that goal with those who really have expertise in that area to implement those type of changes in monitoring and regulation.
Thank you very much. And then I think we'll move on to Brian, and there were a couple of questions in the same vein, which are, have you measured other sources of noise in our urban environment within the DBC framework? So we could think traffic or other noise emitters.
Is this on? I gotta press it. Can everyone hear me now?
Yeah.
Okay, so I don't know how to operate a button, although I can operate a multi-channel analyzer and take lots of data. So as far as that's concerned, it made absolutely no attempt to do anything other than aircraft noise. Aircraft noise was what was the question I was trying to pursue. The websites that I've looked at, the other noise generators, transportation, do seem to match up to Schultz and don't seem to be a problem, or the same kind of a problem, so no, I did not.
I just want to offer a comment. I actually met Dr. Marina Alves Pereira at the 12th Congress of the International Noise Commission in Zurich, and then somebody who's familiar with the European researchers to a level that I am not, took me aside at coffee break and said, you know, Dan, we view her as a little bit of a radical. Now, I don't know if that's because of the quality of her research or if because she's a vivacious woman, Portuguese woman. But so I offer that. I learned, and I've subsequently done some online literature research. There's a whole body of research on what's called vibroacoustic noise. The most common thing here in the States is about wind turbine noise. The research is all over the map. Some say yes, a problem. Some say no, a problem. I have no doubt, Brian, however, that for aviation noise, low frequency noise is a major component.
Thank you. And then I have a question here for you. And it's, I guess, a big picture question, which is, do you think it's realistic, given the sources of noise in our environment, to maintain a threshold below 45 dB? And how could that be envisioned?
No, I didn't use this slide, this illustration from the National Park Service, which is about the only federal agency over the last 40 years since the Environmental Protection Agency's Office of Noise Abatement and Control was defunded in the Reagan era. So National Park is the only federal agency that's done much of anything about noise. And what they did was, I think they might have used the DOT noise map and then took out anthropogenic noise. And without human activity, we evolved in quiet, and basically it's under 45 dBA. So that is actually library quiet. I've personally measured 45 dBA in the main reading room in the Beverly Hills Public Library. So that measurement, using a smartphone app, but you were right when you said that's library quiet. So no, I don't think that is realistic, but I was raised that even if you can't achieve the goal, you might at least try and you'll make things better. And for those in the community who are advocating for quiet noise, I would encourage you to look at the World Health Organization monograph, Environmental Noise Guidelines for the European Region 2017. Look at some of the research references that are listed there, especially the review articles that were prepared by the world's experts of different subject areas, including aviation noise, and then using aviation noise as the health problem it really is. In 12-step programs, they say, first you have to acknowledge that you have a problem. Well, Houston, we got a problem. So use aviation noise as a health problem and educate your elected officials, your regulators, that aviation noise is literally killing their constituents.
Thank you so much. I think in the interest of time, and so everyone could get to lunch, I'll take one more quick question. I invite you all to look at the Slido, including our speakers, because there were some great questions. This one is for Dr. Cheng, and it's relatively quick, which is, well, I think, which is whether you plan to extend your work or have you done work to include cardiovascular risks?
We do plan to extend our work to cardiovascular risk. That is an area of interest of ours.
Okay, great. And I think, again, I think all our speakers, the goal is really to start thinking about alternative metrics and metrics that can align with some of the health impacts of concern for our communities. So thank you very much.